The history of drug prohibition is a controversial one, filled with political motives. Once upon a time, the corporate arm of the British Empire, the East India Trading Company, was the world's biggest drug dealer with their state-sanctioned monopoly of Indian opium. This company, backed up with the most powerful navy in the world, committed many atrocities. However, few compare with what they did to the Qing dynasty of Imperial China in the 19th century. China at that time was in a similar position to today. The West wanted much of their stuff, but they didn't want much stuff from the West. China prided itself on being self-sufficient, producing for itself everything it needed. This meant that China would only accept silver and gold in exchange for their produce. From the mid-17th century, around 28 million kilograms of silver was received by China, principally from European powers. Britain, with their monopoly of opium, sought to create a new market in China for the renewable, addictive product, in order to stop the drain of their limited resources of gold and silver. Company salesmen promoted the recreational use of refined opium, and the flow of silver was soon reversed. Chinese authorities quickly realised the addictive drawbacks to the use of this more concentrated opium and banned the substance. Since the importation of opium into China had been banned by Chinese law, the East India Company had to establish an elaborate trading scheme, partially relying on legal markets and partially leveraging illicit ones. British merchants carrying no opium would buy tea in Canton on credit, and would balance their debt by selling opium at auction in Calcutta. From there, the opium would reach the Chinese coast, hidden aboard British ships, then smuggled into China by native merchants. Within the Chinese Mandarinate, there was an ongoing debate over legalising the opium trade itself. However, this idea was repeatedly rejected, and instead, in 1838, the government sentenced native drug traffickers to death. Around this time, the British were selling roughly 1,400 tonnes per year to China. In March 1839, the Emperor appointed a new strict Confucian commissioner, Lin Zizhu, to control the opium trade at the port of Canton. His first course of action was to enforce the imperial demand that there be a permanent halt to the drug shipments into China. When the British refused to end the trade, Lin blockaded the British traders in their factories and cut off supplies of food. On the 27th of March 1839, Charles Elliot, British Superintendent of Trade, who had been locked in the factories when he arrived at Canton, finally agreed that all British subjects should turn over their opium to Lin, amounting to nearly a year's supply of the drug. In a departure from his brief, Elliot promised that the Crown would compensate the merchants for the lost opium. While this essentially implicated the British government in an illegal enterprise, it also forced a huge liability on the Exchequer. Pressed for compensation by the merchants, this liability is cited as one reason for the decision to force a war. After the opium was surrendered, trade was restarted on the strict condition that no more drugs would be smuggled into China. Lin demanded that British merchants sign a bond promising not to deal in opium under penalty of death. The British officially opposed signing the bond, but some British merchants who did not deal in opium were willing to sign. Lin had the opium disposed of by dissolving it in water, salt and lime, and then dumping it into the ocean. Lin then wrote this letter to Queen Victoria. "We find that your country is 60 or 70,000 li from China, yet there are barbarian ships that strive to come here for trade for the purpose of making great profit. The wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians. That is to say that the great profit made by the barbarians is all taken from the rightful share of China. By what right do they then in return use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Even though that the barbarians may not necessarily intend us harm, yet in coveting profit to an extreme, they have no regard for injuring others. Let us ask, where is your conscience?"
In China, Your Majesty, Lin Zizhu has destroyed £8 million worth of our goods and is driving all the British residents out of Guangzhou.
Well, what shall we do then?
We're looking forward to your instructions.
But I hear you're already assembling marine forces.
As for the Chinese Marine Force, it's a fleet of fishing boats, if anything.
A priest convinced us yesterday that one British warship could sink 10 Chinese warships. Do you believe what he says?
No, I do not. I believe one British warship could destroy the whole Chinese Marine Force.
Mr. Speaker, my honored gentlemen, I come before you to present the plight of a group of defenseless British subjects blockaded in an attempt to starve them into submission, made to surrender their property in trade, which was then destroyed, who were then driven from their quarters in Guangzhou to be confined aboard our ships at sea without food, without water, without medicine, there to float under the pestilent heat of the sun. Before I set out on my journey to England, I was obliged to take leave of my daughter, who, being sick, was unable to travel with me. I may never see her alive again. And yet, our glorious Union Jack still flaps high on our mast. Gentlemen, your countrymen and your sovereign have been grievously wronged. They look to you for reparation.
Open fire.
For fire to fire! Let go! 别介！别介！fire！ 我留在这儿，快呀！
又系朝廷的栋梁，朕要你速返天津，安抚洋人。朕已免了林则徐，并且宽恕洋人煽动兵革之罪。
What we want $6 million taels of silver to compensate for the opium,
We want the opening up of 5 ports for trade. Most of all, we want Hong Kong.
他们要的是600万两的鸦片赔款，开放5口通商口岸，而最主要的是香。
In 1842, the Qing authorities sued for peace, which concluded with the Treaty of Nanking, negotiated in August of that year and ratified in 1843. In the treaty, China was forced to pay an indemnity to Britain, open 4 ports to Britain and cede Hong Kong to Queen Victoria. In the supplementary Treaty of Bogue, the Qing Empire also recognised Britain as an equal to China and gave British subjects extraterritorial privileges in treaty ports. The first Opium War was attacked in the House of Commons by a newly elected young Member of Parliament, William Ewart Gladstone, who wondered if there had ever been a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated to cover this country with a permanent disgrace. However, the issue of opium still had not been resolved. Within China, it still remained a prohibited substance, and Britain still remained the world's biggest dealers. In October 1856, the Chinese authorities in Canton seized a vessel called the Arrow, which had been engaged in piracy. The Arrow had formerly been registered as a British ship. The British consul in Canton demanded the immediate release of the crew and an apology for the insult to the British flag. The crew were released, but an apology was not given. In reprisal, the British government in Hong Kong ordered warships to bombard Canton. Clearly the Chinese had a good case. The Arrow was a pirate ship and had no right to fly the British flag. The bombardment of Canton was a breach of international law. The governor of Hong Kong had acted rashly without consulting London. However, British Prime Minister Palmerston supported the actions of his officials, who claimed to be upholding British prestige and avenging the insult to the flag. Moreover, Palmerston was keen to force the Chinese into accepting full-scale trade with Britain, whether they wanted it or not. Thus began the Second Opium War between 1856 and 1860. Negotiations between China, Britain, France, the USA and Russia led to the Tientsin Treaties of June 1858, which theoretically brought peace. But when China refused to allow foreign diplomats into Peking, hostilities continued. Anglo-French forces invaded, pressing on to Peking, where they occupied and looted the old summer palaces. China again sued for peace and had to agree to all demands, including allowing Christian missionaries into Chinese mainland, and of course the legalization of opium. The legalized free trade of opium in China had interesting consequences, and undoubtedly the reverse effect of what Britain had intended. Firstly, legalization caused the price of opium to crash because the alchemy of prohibition was over. More importantly, over the next few decades, Britain lost its monopoly of opium. China moved towards self-sufficiency and became the largest producer of opium to provide for the huge market that had been created. Additionally, the German company Bayer had created heroin, which ironically was marketed as a medicine for opium and morphine addiction.
This piece of history is brought to you by Bayer. For prompt control of senile agitation, try new Bayer aspirin. Now with heroin. Heroin, the premier remedy for bronchitis, whooping coughs, etc.
A cynic may suspect that the major players involved in this industry observed the more favourable conditions for profit under prohibition and monopoly control and sought to recreate these conditions. But it's not surprising that in this instance China wanted to prohibit opium, but it's clear that the drug use was not the problem. The problem was the cunning ruthlessness and greed of perhaps the most powerful organisation the world has ever known, the British Empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Americans, in an attempt to achieve their domestic control objectives, while internationally embarrassed the British and put an end to the profitable drug trade dominated by colonial powers, as well as currying favour with the Chinese to improve economic relations with Asia, lobbied and organised 12 countries to meet at The Hague on the 1st of December 1911 to draft a treaty. The agenda clearly was not international. The focus was on Chinese opium, and the US and Britain dominated proceedings. The US was pushing for prohibition, while Britain attempted to deflect attention and dilute the opium agenda by insisting that manufactured drugs such as morphine, heroin and cocaine be considered. Britain was hoping for a fair treaty that would level the playing field for British pharmaceutical companies against the newly dominant German synthetic drug industry. Britain argued that curbing such trade would be useless until China brought its domestic production under control. The establishment of the League of Nations in 1919 following the First World War gave the international community a centralised body to administer drug control. Yet the drug problem only seemed to get worse. The Chinese continued to overproduce opium. Additionally, Chinese imports of heroin and morphine had increased rapidly. The European powers continued to profit from drugs through government monopolies. As Western European governments pressured pharmaceutical companies to conform to more rigorous controls, corrupt operators moved to countries that had not ratified the International Opium Convention. The drug industry became more sophisticated in their operations, conspiring with political and/or military agents to avoid prosecution. Drug users and suppliers provided to be just as resourceful as diplomats and bureaucrats.